Hello fellow collectors, I hope you are doing wonderfully well. Today I continue with my ongoing series where I talk about the best films I watched in the preceding month, and today we look at my November in film. As I mentioned in my last video, I'm cracking on with trying to reduce my watch list as much as possible before we reach the end of the year, and in November I very much continued on with that journey, and again wanted in particular to watch a few of the films that have been sat on my shelves waiting to be seen for the longest amount of time, and it led me to some absolutely wonderful films. But I also enjoyed a good few rewatches this month too, as you'll see. So, without any further ado, let's get right into it and talk about the best films I watched in November. First up, and we have To Sir with Love. From 1967 and directed by James Clavell, it stars Sidney Poitier as the teacher, and then a whole bunch of young actors as the kids, including Christian Roberts, Susie Kendall, Judy Geeson, and a young singer of the time called Lulu, as well as many more. I originally came to this one because I remember watching an interview with Lawrence Fishburne, and it might have been his Letterboxd top 4 or maybe something else where he was talking about some of his favourite films, but he mentioned To Sir with Love being among his favourites and talked briefly about it, and it really sparked my interest. So I was keen to pick it up in the following indicator sale, which was October 2022. And to my shame, it has been sat on my shelves unappreciated since then, so it was high time I checked it out. Well, I was really surprised to find that this was a British film, because of course Sidney Poitier was American, and perhaps if I'd known that I might have gotten to it sooner, but that was very unexpected. So, it starts with Sidney Poitier commuting through 1960s London, which endeared me to it already because this is a film that's also like a wonderful time capsule, where they filmed on the real streets surrounded by real people at times, and seeing London as it was back then was just so lovely. He plays a man who has been very well educated, but has been really struggling to find a job in his field, so he's just resorted to look for something that can tide him over until he finds a job he actually wants. And that turns out to be as a teacher in a school for troubled kids, most of whom have already been thrown out of other schools. And so begins his difficult journey to learn how to become a teacher and how to handle such a difficult bunch of kids. Poitier, as of course you would expect, is nothing short of superb here. He plays the character so well, showing the anger and frustration, but also the resolve and determination too, and a somewhat paternal, caring nature towards these young people. He has a great chemistry with those around him, interacting with the other teachers who are a mixed variety themselves, from overly jaded and at the end of their tether to perhaps a bit too soft. And Poitier comes in right at the middle, wanting to make a change and wanting to really help these kids, and in a way without the baggage of previous teaching experience. Judy Geeson and Christian Roberts were the standouts among the kids, both delivering fantastic performances too. I think that the relationship that is developed with Christian Roberts' character in particular is such a wonderful one to watch as the film progresses. Overall, this was a really moving story that touched me deeply and swept me away for 105 minutes. I'm still very early on in my exploration of Sidney Poitier's films, but everything I've seen him in so far has been fantastic, so I'm very keen to continue on with that journey. Next up, and we have The Bourne Identity, though if you'll allow me some artistic license, I'll talk a bit more widely about the franchise as a whole too, and then I'll move on to, perhaps unexpectedly, The Bourne Legacy in some more depth. But Identity, the first film, is from 2002 and directed by Doug Liman, and the following two in the trilogy were directed by Paul Greengrass, with Liman taking on the executive producer role. Identity stars Matt Damon, Franca Potente, Chris Cooper, Brian Cox, Clive Owen, Gabriel Mann, and more. For some reason these films have just been on my mind recently, and I've been really keen to revisit them, as it's been a few years since I last made my way through the franchise. I have a lot of nostalgia for these films, and for The Bourne Identity in particular. It's actually the first film that I remember vividly being made aware of by the advertising, and in particular the posters. I don't think I ever saw a single trailer for The Bourne Identity on TV or anywhere else, but all around my hometown there were these small versions of billboards which had the poster, and of course on the sides of buses as well, and they seemed to be up there for ages, and it really made me curious. Unfortunately, I can't really remember the first time I saw it, but I have had these DVDs for a very long time, I think the DVD came out for Identity around in 2003, so I might well have had these for nearing 20 years at this point. Anyway, I have watched and rewatched these films countless times over the years, and for a long while I would have classed the first three as among my very favourite trilogies, along the likes of Lord of the Rings and the original Star Wars, which is to say that even now my ability to look at them with a more objective eye is probably still highly diminished, but I do think that these are absolutely fantastic films, even outside the rosy nostalgia goggles, and I think they hold up brilliantly. Identity has one of my favourite introductions to a film. A man floating in a stormy sea. You assume, of course, that he's dead. And he gets randomly and luckily spotted and then picked up by a passing fishing vessel. The mysteries continue as one of the crew, presumably with some medical training, looks the stranger over to try to help, and he comes across bullet wounds and a curious item under the skin on his hip. And the atmosphere of intrigue is firmly set, and as it turns out, the man isn't quite dead, and when he's asked, "What's your name?" he says, "I don't know," and it's just such a great setup for the film to come. Following that, we follow along as Jason Bourne, played wonderfully by Matt Damon, who, as I understand it, they took a chance on casting for the role, as while he'd starred in some great films up to that point, was hardly an action star, as he then tries to unravel the mystery of who he is, discovering along the way a very specific set of skills, as we see him battle in some absolutely fantastic and frenetic action scenes that includes that iconic car chase in a little red Mini through the streets of Paris. It's a great espionage thrill ride, with the twist of a man suffering from amnesia thrown in there as he races to find answers, and all the while the CIA are racing to try to react to his strange behaviour and stop him. Chris Cooper is also brilliant here as the head of the CIA team working to try to track Bourne down and clean up the mess that he's made. Cold, calculated and manipulative, Cooper portrays it all perfectly. People are more like chess pieces to him, and he doesn't hesitate to do or say whatever it takes. And of course, not to forget Franca Potente, who is also so wonderful here. And I do wonder why she didn't become a bigger star with Run Lola Run, followed by the Bourne Identity. It seems like her trajectory was only going upwards. But regardless, she is so great here, with her character who gets embroiled in this business through no fault of her own. Potente brilliantly portrays the scared, confused and swept away nature of a normal person thrown into a wild situation. All this along with some great camera work that changed the way fight scenes were shot for a good while afterwards, and also a great soundtrack from John Powell, the composer. And how can I forget Moby, the song Extreme Ways, which works perfectly to complement the film and is now synonymous with the Bourne series. And as soon as I hear it, it immediately elicits this absolute excitement from me. Overall, it's just a brilliant, fast-paced thrill ride from start to finish, with great performances, interesting action and an intriguing story. Great stuff. And of course, following that, we then have the Bourne Supremacy, which for me, though I think it's the weakest outing of the three films, is still pretty great. I always enjoy Carl Urban's performances, and though his accent is a little bit weird here, he's still a great nemesis for Bourne, and the car chase is again in this film absolutely blistering. There was just one surprising death in this one, which, though I'm sure most of us have seen these, I won't spoil just in case someone hasn't, but I've never been all that keen on it. In a way, it's entirely unexpected and really adds some emotional punch, but I felt like the character was needed later on in the film and also in the third film too, as they try to kind of shoehorn in someone else a bit and it falls a bit flat for me, but just a small criticism. And lastly, of course, we have the Bourne Ultimatum, which polishes off the story of these three films, or it used to anyway. And again, it opens up the mystery as more and more of the layers of this entire CIA operation are steadily revealed. And most importantly for me, the film comes to a satisfying conclusion. As we start in the water, so we end in the water, with the echoes from the first film, with the line from Clive Owen's character, "Look at us, look at what they make you give," still ringing in our ears. What an amazing trilogy. But, of course, as we are so used to now in our modern days, things didn't stop there, and 5 years later, in 2012, we got something similar, but a bit different with the Bourne Legacy. Directed by Tony Gilroy, who you might know as the director of Michael Clayton, and this one starring Jeremy Renner, Rachel Weisz and Edward Norton, among some other pretty big names. For me, this film is really underrated. I know it wasn't received all that well at the time, but I was still surprised to see it sat at only a 2.8 out of 5 on Letterboxd. So my thoughts on this one are definitely in the minority. I did see some comments asking where was Matt Damon in this, but I remember at the time it was pretty clear this was a spin-off and I never had any expectations he would be in it at all, so I wonder if that's why people were disappointed and I wasn't. It is called Legacy, after all. But anyway, as I say, for me this one is underrated, as I've really enjoyed watching it several times over the years, and my thoughts on it didn't change a bit with this rewatch. It has some brilliantly tense action. In particular, a superb scene takes place at the doctor's house, played so well by Rachel Weisz, which is just heart-racing and panic-inducing stuff. It's incredibly well done. Also, there is a fantastic meeting of Renner and Oscar Isaac's character, isolated in this wintry woodland, and their entire meeting is just racked with mistrust and tension for us. Here we have two assets, assassins, meeting for the first time, and the violence threatening to break loose, just bubbling under the surface, is palpable at each moment, as neither of them know what clandestine orders the other might have. Oscar Isaac is really great here too, despite it being a fairly small role for him. I also really liked the widening of the story, with them elaborating on associated programs to Treadstone. It felt realistic that there would be several of these top secret projects going on, shadows within shadows, where very few people know the full story, and not to mention the expendable nature not only of the people in the field, but also internally, which is shown pretty brutally. Performance-wise, Renner and Weisz are the standouts for me. I'm a big fan of Rachel Weisz anyway. I think she is a phenomenal actor, and even if she's in a mediocre film, always raises its bar with her performance. Here she is brilliant as a scientist, one of the people usually behind the scenes, who gets put very much into the foreground of the danger and destruction. Renner is also really good here as well. I feel like he's a bit of an underrated actor as well actually, with the Marvel films perhaps dominating people's perceptions of him, but I always really enjoy his films and performances. Of course, it's not a perfect film though, and as it seems to take place during the events of another film, it does steal some shots and moments from that one, which I didn't really care for at all. I don't see any reason it couldn't have taken place at a different time. And also, I'll say, it's not the best ending. It just sort of ends a bit, without much of a resolution, but perhaps they were expecting to make another one, and of course the more neutral, or shall we say negative, reaction put an end to that. Regardless though, this is a solid action thriller, and perhaps if it wasn't related to the Bourne films, people would have been kinder to it. But for me, I really enjoy it, and if you haven't seen it for a while, I'd say it's worth revisiting. Up next, and we have They Made Me a Fugitive, a film from 1947 and directed by Alberto Cavalcanti, though credited as just Cavalcanti in the film. It stars Trevor Howard, Sally Gray, Griffith Jones, Renee Ray, Mary Marrale, Michael Brennan, Charles Farrell, Jack McNaughton and more. This one was a real surprise for me. Whether it was the artwork, which is, I feel, a little lacklustre, or perhaps I'd confused it by reading about another film, but I was expecting something very average here. But lo and behold, I actually loved it and thought it was fantastic. It's a British crime thriller, but one with some added elements. Similar to Sir with Love, this one is also like a time capsule, but rather than being one for a city, it's one for the national feeling and zeitgeist for post-war Britain, and that's something I found incredibly interesting. Being a film from 1947, just a couple years after the war, which was still so fresh in people's minds, and still in the news with trials taking place, but people aren't the same as they were during that time, nor perhaps as willing to put up with what they did during those 6 years. The war has taken its toll on the national feeling and morale. Indeed, our main character, played wonderfully by Trevor Howard, an actor that I've really liked in everything I've seen him in, is a former member of the RAF and former prisoner of war. He is a man that was taught to fight and battle, and now the war is over, that's just not needed anymore. But he can't just change overnight, and he just hasn't been able to fit back into society or find his place, which leads him to getting in with some bad characters, and that's how our story kicks off. And it's a dark story, with some surprisingly brutal moments really giving it some weight and consequence. It's a story with some fantastic tension and quite a few emotional moments as well when the tough stuff does happen, all elevated by some superb acting. Howard is of course fantastic, but also Sally Gray, who was brilliant here and had some great chemistry with him, and Griffith Jones, who I wasn't familiar with before, but he embodies a great villain here, smarmy, dangerous and smart. He also has some great lines like, "Next time you want to play with fire, use a matchbox instead." Superb stuff. The ending I thought was also really great here, very unexpected in a way, particularly for films of the time, and I wonder whether that might also be a reflection in part of the national feelings of the time it was made. Really an interesting watch, and a wonderful surprise that I look forward to revisiting in the future. Next up, we have my section on films that I've not quite made my mind up on yet. They might have been particularly curious or mysterious, or just interestingly different in some way. And this month I have just one of these, and it's Carla's Song. From 1996 and directed by Ken Loach, it stars Robert Carlyle, Oyanka Cabezas as our main characters. Interestingly, this one was written by Paul Laverty, based on his own actual experiences having lived and worked in Nicaragua for several years for a human rights organisation. This was a film that felt unlike anything I'd ever really seen before. We go from the grey and overcast streets of Glasgow to a war-torn Nicaragua, and it's such a strange and jarring juxtaposition of the two, and even though I'd read the summary before I watched it, so was expecting this switch, I still found it really quite impactful and powerful. It's a film about a romance between a bus driver and a Nicaraguan woman who meet in Glasgow thanks to a kind-hearted gesture. There is just something about her that Carlyle's character can't shake from his thoughts, and he pursues her over the course of the first part of the film. She is a mystery, clearly having been through some terrible trauma of some kind, and he is just inexplicably drawn to her. And then we shift, and it of course leads them to going to Nicaragua. Robert Carlyle in particular is just superb here. He gives a great performance, showing that he has a good heart, and also showing really well how, when faced with real life-threatening danger and war, it is just overwhelming and terrifying. You can be told you're going somewhere to help people or to a war-torn nation, you can see it on TV and know it's happening, but being at risk from imminent violence and danger is undoubtedly panic-inducing, and he portrays the tidal wave of emotions that you would face when dealing with that just so incredibly well. This one is a tough watch, dealing with some brutal and awful themes, but it was one that spurred me on to find out more about this war in Nicaragua and the Contras, who I'd of course heard of but didn't really have any idea who or what they stood for. But this one is such a worthwhile watch that has a really great ending as well. And so, finally that brings us on to my honourable mentions, and there are quite a few this month. First up is Elegant Beast, a really great and interesting film that is shot phenomenally well. It reminded me of Dial M for Murder, in so much as for a film that takes place in a fairly confined space, it never feels claustrophobic. The camera angles and the use of the set to divide the screen at times was astonishingly good. Next is School Ties, which I thought was also really great. An interesting film because it's all about anti-Semitism in a private school, and perhaps commenting on it in an American society at large at the time. But it just seemed a bit odd for me for it to be so rife, given that it's set in 1955, barely 10 years after World War II, and I would have thought anti-Semitism would have been at an all-time low. Something else that I was really curious to read more about. Then we have Lover Come Back, a lovely and amusing rom-com with Doris Day and Rock Hudson. Next is Mountains of the Moon, which is a favourite of Neil's from Neil's Movie Channel, and he's the reason why I picked this one up. A brilliant exploration and adventure film about finding the source of the Nile. It reminded me in some ways of another film that I really enjoy in the genre, which is The Lost City of Z. But there are some further explored elements in this one, with the strains of the relationship between our two main characters, where betrayal, mistrust and some poisonous words have their harsh consequences, which added some really unexpected elements to this one. Then we have Serenity. I just recently rewatched the entirety of Firefly again, which is one of my absolute favourite TV shows. A space western without equal, really. And of course, you have to follow it up by watching Serenity. Always a joy to revisit. Next is Outrage, a film directed by Ida Lupino. Yep, that Ida Lupino. And it was fantastic and deals with, again, some really difficult subject matters, but I think undoubtedly incredibly important for the time, and I'm really keen to now watch Lupino's other films too. And then last but not least, we have The Brothers Rico, a fantastic story about family and crime featuring a superb performance from Richard Conte. This is a film that definitely hits hard. And if you'll allow me, just before I end the video, I just wanted to take a minute to appreciate Indicator, as they are responsible for several films from my Best of November list, but also because The Brothers Rico happened to be the last film I needed to see from the Columbia Noir box sets number 1 to number 5. I finally finished them. I do know that there's the Whistler set now as well, but that sort of feels like something a bit different, all being about one character, and I'm not sure I'm all that interested in it. But these 5 glorious sets have sat on my shelves for years now. I picked up the first one in November 2021, and then the second in December 2021, and so started my journey. These are such treasure troves of some brilliant film noir, and it's been such a pleasure to explore the films. Some incredible and just a few a little bit pants, but overall it's been a joy to watch. I remember thinking at one point, wow, I'm never going to get through all of these. But lo and behold, the day finally came. And I'm now delighted to have picked up Universal Noir number 1 in their most recent sale, so I can start a new journey into film noir all over again. Just top tier stuff from Indicator. What a wonderful label. So thanks to them for so many hours of enjoyment from these absolute beauties. And well, that brings us to the end of the video and my November in film. I hope yours was also a wonderful month of exploring some fantastic films, and I hope your December has been going great too. Have a lovely Christmas, stay warm and cosy, and watch some great films. Well, that's everything from me. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.